Cherokees are not foreigners, but original inhabitants of America. They now inhabit and stand on the soil of their own territory, and the states by which they are now surrounded have been created out of the land which was once theirs.
Under the Washington administration, and indeed all the administrations down to that of Andrew Jackson, the United States had dealt with the Cherokees as though they were a sovereign power. That is, they dealt with them as a distinct nation. Andrew Jackson, however, believed that this was an absurdity. The United States simply should dictate terms to Native people and force them to follow those terms.
Andrew Jackson favored the rapid settlement of western and southern lands by whites. He felt that previous efforts to promote the assimilation of Indian peoples had failed.
The civilization program sought to convert Native people into cultural replicas of Anglo-Americans. The United States government promoted this by funding agents who went to live among Southern Indians to teach them how to farm. I always find that rather amusing because Native people had been farming for at least 3,000 or 4,000 years by then.
The Cherokee were more receptive than most Native American peoples to adapting European ideas to their way of life. Most dramatic, perhaps, was the creation of a Cherokee alphabet.
By 1826, the Cherokee Nation had published its newspaper, the Phoenix, in Cherokee and in English. By 1830, we passed the Constitution, and Georgia was absolutely galled at the effrontery of the Cherokee Nation to establish a constitutional government within its borders.
Jackson's first State of the Union message promoted the idea of removing Native Americans from their lands within the territorial United States. The Removal Act of 1830 called for the relocation of 500,000 Indian peoples to territory west of the Mississippi.
If they cannot be emigrated, they should be exterminated.
President Jackson met with chiefs in the South and urged them to relocate voluntarily, offering large sums of money and land. The Choctaws, the Creeks, and the Chickasaws negotiated resettlement, but none of them ever saw any of the promised federal money. The Seminoles retreated into the swampland of Florida, where from 1835 to 1842, they fought U.S. troops. Ultimately, only a few hundred eluded death or capture. Meanwhile, the Cherokee Nation tried every available avenue to resist the removal policy.
The vast majority of Cherokees did not want to go west, and the Cherokees' leadership, primarily Chief John Ross, fought very hard against removal.
The wisest option was to talk, to negotiate. When that failed, they began to lobby. They had a very significant lobby through the churches, through those who wished well for the Indians in the Northeast. Ralph Waldo Emerson joined that effort and wrote some very dramatic prose objecting to the removal.
They fought removal in a number of different ways, but perhaps the one that has come to the attention of historians most clearly is their fight in the Supreme Court. In 1832, Worcester versus Georgia was handed down by the Supreme Court, which recognized that the Cherokees did have sovereign rights. This was an enormously important decision because it nullified Georgia law within the Cherokee Nation. What happened, of course, was that the state of Georgia refused to obey the decision. The Georgia legislature established a lottery and began distributing Cherokee land to its own citizens. I think that Jackson's views on Indian removal were extraordinarily well known. And when the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Worcester versus Georgia, I think that most people understood that Jackson would do little to enforce the decision of the court. Consequently, when Georgia chose to ignore the decision, the United States government did nothing.
In October of 1838, the forced migration of 18,000 Cherokees began.
Families at dinner were startled by the sudden gleam of bayonets in the doorway and rose up to be driven with blows and oaths along the weary miles of trail that led to the stockade. Men were seized in their fields or going along the road. Women were taken from their wheels and children from their play.
They lost people in the stockades. They lost them on that cold walk from the dead of winter of 1838 to 1839. 4,000 died, the weak, the infirm, the elderly. Trapped in ice in Illinois. It separated families and it broke communities up. So the historic patterns of villages and families and clans was disturbed. It was a Holocaust. And many times the pain is so deep it takes generations and generations to express. Sometimes it takes the seventh generation to finally uncover and release that historic grief. We've come to believe that the Cherokees have a great legacy. And that legacy is we're a people that face adversity, survive, adapt, prosper, and excel. And you can see that best in the Trail of Tears episode, because after such a horrific removal, we get to Indian Territory and we rebuild our government.
But many Cherokees would never forgive Andrew Jackson for the loss of their homelands.
Many Cherokees registered as Republicans only because Andrew Jackson was a Democrat. Many Cherokees several generations ago would not carry a $20 bill because of their hatred of Jackson.
The effect of Indian removal for whites was that it was one more step toward making the United States a white man's country. Indian removal coincides with the development of very strict racial codes in the South, which limited the rights of free blacks. It coincides with a period in which women actually lose political rights. It is a period in which the United States becomes more democratic for adult white men, but less democratic for everyone else.